like after growth, make this broader heading sectoral analysis of economy. Sectoral means agriculture, industry and services. So now we are referring to a specific sector. So sectoral description of economy है. So when you explain sectoral distribution, obviously it will be including service sector, then industry and agriculture. Agricultural sector, industrial sector and service sector. Within industry there will be various points, within agriculture there will be many points. So when we start that sectoral, one by one इसे करते जाएंगे. This will take only one class, that is service sector. In industry there are many things to explain. In agriculture also there are many things to explain. So within service sector, the content will be, it will be in terms of, the subtopic will be service sector growth. And when you compare service sector growth, you have to compare that service sector growth with respect to industry as well as agriculture. So over a period of time, how growth of service sector had occurred. Then you have to analyze that service sector in terms of employment also. So when you explain employment, it becomes the occupational structure. So what percentage of population or labor force or workforce engaged in service sector. So that way, in that way, the above one will be called as sectoral composition. So normally when you use the sectoral composition of GDP, so how much GDP comes from that sector. When you say occupational structure, then it is distribution of labor force between these three sectors. Then the third topic will be service led or service sector trade. After that, impact of liberalization on service sector. Impact of liberalization on service sector. So you have to explain that service sector based upon growth, one parameter, based on employment, second parameter, based on trade, so particularly how much is say service export. So based upon that you will be highlighting the trade. Then impact of liberalization. Within that liberalization, the role of service sector in FDI. And for this topic, the source will be, there are two articles from APW. Both article by Rupa Chanda. So there are in fact two articles. Though different may, you have to include both. And apart from these two articles, सर्वे के अकॉर्डिंगली जो इन्फॉर्मेशन होगा 17-18 का वो इंक्लूड कर लेंगे. So generally the question in the service sector is sometimes a question is being asked, is growth in India service led growth or is India over tertiarized? So is it over tertiarized? How you will answer it is over tertiarized. ये tertiary sector हो गया. Primary sector is agriculture, secondary sector is industry, tertiary sector is service. So is it over tertiarized? But to answer is whether it is over tertiarized or not, when you say over, you have to compare it, compared with some other country. Other country के relation में आप explain करेंगे, and you can compare Indian economy with Indian economy also with respect to different point of time. So intertemporal analysis होगा और inter country description भी आ जाएगा. So whether it is over tertiarized or is it a service led growth, so if you are able to explain that part only, then you can justify. So there are only few questions from service sector. There are no subtopic like In agriculture there will be many subtopic. Agriculture price policy separate, agriculture policy separate, land reform separate, green revolution separate. So there are many subtopic in agriculture, but there are few subtopic in service sector. So the reference source will be this. So in that way, first paragraph in service sector, the Indian economy has undergone major macroeconomic structural reform, since 1991. Full stop. Trade, FDI and industrial policies. Trade, FDI and industrial policies has been liberalized. Full stop. Institutional, legislative and regulatory measures. Institutional, legislative and regulatory measures have been undertaken to improve macroeconomic management. Liberalization of economy has helped to put Indian economy on a higher growth trajectory. With compound annual growth rate arising from 5.8% during 1990s, 5.8% during 1990s to 7.3% in the post 2000 period. 7.3% in the post 2000 period. Full stop. India has been one of the fastest growing economies in the past 2 decades. In this, the first class you have noted this table, class 1 growth record. So when you explain that growth record from 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s and the recent one, so when you always better to read such table again and again, because now you are focusing on this part, the service sector. So when you explain that service sector growth over a period of time, you have to relate that service sector growth from overall GDP growth rate. So what was the major reason behind a high growth rate of GDP after 1991? So 90s growth rate, and you have to be specific about the recent growth rate as well. So in the recent years, the high growth rate was mainly because of high growth in service sector. There is high growth rate, but that high growth rate is mainly because of the service sector growth. And another important point is that in the overall GDP, the weightage of service sector has also gone up. So one thing, weightage has increased, and second, the greater weightage has increased at a rapid rate. वेटेज ज़्यादा है और उस सर्विस सेक्टर का ग्रोथ रेट एज कंपेयर टू एग्रीकल्चर इंडस्ट्री इज ऑल्सो वेरी हाई. सो वी हैव टू यूज दिस पार्ट सर्विस सेक्टर ग्रोथ इन दिस आर्टिकल. ठीक है, तो इन दिस आर्टिकल दिस विल बी बिकमिंग मोर रेलिवेंट, एंड इन दी व्हेन यू विल स्टडी इंडस्ट्री दिस विल बिकम मोर रेलिवेंट, एंड इन एग्रीकल्चर दिस विल बी मोर रेलिवेंट. बट अगेन अब आजकल के कंटेक्स्ट में जितने भी डेटा है, गवर्नमेंट इज क्वेश्चनिंग द पास्ट डेटा ऑल्सो नो. तो आप क्या लिखोगे क्या नहीं लिखोगे, इग्नोरिंग दैट पॉलिटिकल कंट्रोवर्सी, अदरवाइज तो हमारी पूरी इकनॉमी से बदल जाएगी, क्योंकि जो भी अभी तक पढ़ रखा है वो सारा रिकॉर्ड ही आपने बदल दिया. तो अगर सारा का सारा पास्ट रिकॉर्ड ही आप डिफरेंट कर लोगे कि अर्लियर आप अभी तक लिखते हैं कि 8.3% का ग्रोथ था 2003 to 2009, and now suddenly you say no, the growth rate was just 6.3. So backdated, if you change the base year, and from that base year if you calculate GDP growth rate from the back date, then it can be revised. So methodology can always be manipulated by the government. So ignoring that, whatever will be the authenticity of that, जो authentic book में अभी तक के जो published article है, based upon that you have to answer. ठीक है, so rarely there will be any such question, but otherwise don't change that overall concept. So there will be some element, but final जो भी information आता है, but अभी तक के जितने भी article है उसमें आपको अपने concept को change नहीं करना है कि उस period का growth rate ये था. So don't modify that, because reliability of that data has to be verified. उसको अभी establish होना है कि change actual में क्या हो रहा है. So given that, you have to explain that service sector. Next paragraph में, the service sector has played an important role. Service sector has played an important role in enabling this improved economic performance, during the post reform period. Full stop. Services have been fastest growing sector. Services have been fastest growing sector of Indian economy, and it has helped in accelerating the overall growth rate of economy. Full stop. It has also facilitated also facilitated India's integration with world economy. India's integration with world economy. The significant growth in information technology enabled services, simply IT enabled services. The significant growth in IT enabled services has helped India to achieve higher growth, and put India on a global map. Also, it has also helped in improving productivity in other sectors, and thereby contributing to improvement in economy's overall competitiveness. Now first analyze that growth aspect. So subheading growth, after that employment, then trade. If you highlight only the recent data, तो सर्वे के अकॉर्डिंगली ये टेबल रिप्रोड्यूस कर लीजिएगा. Table 1 in this article. Say for different year, if you explain service, agriculture and industry. For 2014-15, 15-16, 17-18, 16-17, 16-17 and 17-18. So service sector growth was 9.7, 7.7, then it was 8.3, the 9.7 and 9.7 remained there in 2 years. After that 7.7 and then 8.3. To compare with agriculture, it was minus 0.2, then 0.7, 4.9, 2.1. Industry 7.5, 8.8, 5.6, 4.1. And overall GDP was 7.5, 8, 7.1, 6.5. For a shorter period you can learn that data, वो याद रख सकते हो आप. for 2 or 3 years. It will be difficult to write data like this. इस तरीके का डेटा वहाँ पर रिप्रोड्यूस नहीं कर पाओगे, but you can write it for a shorter period, last 2-3 years at least. And apart from that, if you can use a second table just to show service sector growth. So for that service sector, 1950s it was just 3.6, so intertemporal analysis can be done. 1960s was 3.6 was overall, 3.9 in service sector, 4.8. 1970s was 4.4. 1980s 6.5 and 1990 7.3. And with respect to overall, it was 3.64, 2.9, 5.6 and 5.8 GDP. ठीक है, it is same data which was quoted in first class, same information है, break करके लिख रहे हैं within this growth under this heading. Write down. This service sector has exhibited significant growth rate. Service sector has exhibited or shown. Service sector has exhibited significant growth rate in the past 2 decades. In the past 2 decades, the annual average growth rate, increased from 7% during 1988 to 1998, increased from 7% during 1988 to 1998 to 9.2% after 2000, to 9.2% after 2000. And thereby exceeding overall GDP growth, overall GDP growth of 7.5% during this period. Of 7.5% during this period. That means service sector growth is greater as compared to the growth rate of GDP. Next paragraph. During the same period, agricultural growth rate was lower. Agricultural growth rate was lower at 2.2%. At 2.2%, and industrial growth was at 7.7%. Industrial growth was 7.7%. full stop. It shows that service sector performed. It shows that service sector performed better. Service sector performed better as compared to rest of economy. As compared to rest of economy. However, growth performance within service sector has been uneven. Growth performance within service sector has been uneven. So for the overall sector as a whole, the overall growth was impressive. But if you break up the service sector itself, then in that service sector the growth was uneven. For some services growth rate was very high, and for many services growth rate was low, but the overall growth rate was high. So that aggregate has to be disaggregated now further. In what way it was uneven? So the driving segment has been communication. The driving segment has been communication, banking and insurance, construction, trade and distribution service, which have grown at a rate of over 7% since 2000. On the other hand, services such as railways, administration services, have grown at less than 4%. Full stop. These subsector trends reflect difference in policy and regulatory measures. Across different services, and the role of rising income and domestic demand. Role of rising income and domestic demand in driving growth in some services. Full stop. Communication service has been fastest growing service sector. Reflecting the significant, reflecting the significant liberalization and deregulation in this sector since 1990s. Remember, apart from that, policy changes or institutional changes, always remember, as income of economy increases, with increase in income we demand different goods, but income elasticity of different goods are not same. So as your income increases, you also buy more food, but for food income elasticity is less than 1. As your income increases, you buy manufactured goods also. As income increases, you buy various services also. But the change in agricultural demand, industrial demand and services demand are not uniform. Beyond a certain level of income, the income elasticity of food will be very low. So as your income increases, there is more and more demand for services, because when income is low, most of the income to satisfy basic need. As income increases, then you buy health facility or better health facility, spend more on education, spend more on communication, spend more on travel. So those spending will increase only when income increases. So as growth in the economy occurred, out of that growth, more growth shifted towards service sector and less towards the other sector. So remember, apart from the policy, you are promoting it by changing policy also. So if the youth are having a specific policy towards communication, the communication sector will grow. If you do not have the same policy towards railway, if railway was not liberalized, then the growth in that sector will be slow. So the growth depends on, some growth will occur automatically without any change also. Some growth are induced, triggered by policy change. So if you have some policy change, then due to that policy change, some services has grown at a faster rate. So you have to consider that as income increases, the service sector is bound to increase at a higher rate. So as a result, out of that 100 income generated, majority of income is now generated in the service sector itself. Next paragraph, within that growth itself. The high growth rate of service, has contributed to its rising share in the overall economy. Full stop. Between 1950 to 1990, agriculture share in GDP declined by about 25%. Agriculture share in GDP declined by about 25%, with corresponding increase in share of industry and service, being distributed roughly evenly. However, the average share of industry in overall GDP, average share of industry in overall GDP has declined from around 22% in 1990 to 94 to 20% in 2005 to 2009 to 20% in 2005 to 2009. On the other hand, share of agriculture declined from around 30% to 18%. Around 30% to 18% in the same period. And it has reduced further. Full stop. It was matched by corresponding rise in services in the economy. एक्चुअल में एक्सप्लेन आप ये कह रहे हो कि जो 1950 टू 1990 पीरियड में द डिक्लाइन इन एग्रीकल्चर शेयर वाज evenly distributed between industry and services, so both benefited in terms of share, but after 1990 the more benefit is to service sector with bypassing the industry. So in that way also sometimes it is being said that the middle, that is industry, is missing. So the industrial share remained almost same, so that loss of agriculture shifted directly to the service sector. So the share of service sector increased more after 1990. Even before that also there was increase, but the loss of agriculture was distributed between industry and services more evenly, and after 1990 it is more towards service sector. Services constitute in excess of 60% of GDP. Services constitute in excess of 60% of GDP, and it is up from 48% of GDP in 1990. It is up from 48% of GDP in 1990. So in 1990 the share of service was 48% and it is now in excess of 60%. This is in sharp contrast to many other developing economies. This is in sharp contrast to many other developing economies. Many other developing economies where decline in share of agriculture has been followed by corresponding rise in has been followed by corresponding rise in share of industry, corresponding rise in share of industry, and in particular manufacturing, in particular manufacturing, and later in services, later in services. Thus there has been leapfrogging of economy. Thus there has been leapfrogging of economy, leapfrogging of economy from dependency on primary sector, dependency on primary sector to tertiary sector, dependency on primary sector to tertiary sector. So in India basically we find that leapfrogging from industry to agriculture, agriculture to industry to services. So it has leapfrogged from agriculture to service directly, bypassing that industrial sector.
But why is like this the natural progression?
Natural progression in the sense you require the use of services later on. Once you are able to produce more goods, then you require logistic service. You can't say you require logistic service before producing it. All distribution network, all communication network we will be requiring in a subsequent phase. So this is the better way of growth. Main pattern of growth is this. Now what will be the advantage of that? The advantage is that as labor move from, as the share increases, labor will also move to that sector. So if it has greater employment elasticity, it will be generating more job. So that growth will be more sustainable. And if you just bypass that sector, then it will be having growth, but that may be jobless growth, because the growth was due to higher productivity, not by employing more worker. Because in service sector productivity is higher, but how you come to conclusion that service sector productivity is higher and in agriculture it was low? Simple fact, if majority of workforce engaged in agriculture generate just 13 to 14% of GDP, so that 13% of GDP distributed between 60% of population, and very few percentage of population contribute 60% to that GDP. So that 60% of income is distributed among few person, which means productivity in services more as compared to productivity in agriculture. So the pattern of growth in other countries is basically from agriculture to industry. Once that industry will expand and it will have a broader base, then you require more and more services. But what happens in India, that because of fast technological change, IT enabled services, they expanded at a very fast rate, because economy at the same point was liberalized also. You are providing services to US companies also. By sitting here you are providing that service. So that information technology enabled services, particularly से BPO जितने भी फॉर्म है वो सर्विस सेक्टर का, तो उनका जो फास्ट ग्रोथ है, that fast growth basically increase the share of service sector in India. So in that way, to some extent you can say you are criticizing that growth path. The ideal growth path India did not follow. Now for that purpose we can say to some extent policy is also responsible, because policy give incentive. So if you have designed a better institutional framework for service and not for industry and not for agriculture, now if you say if there is a farmer distress, so who is responsible there? It is the overall or long period neglect of agriculture still persisting. Now if that is persisting, it will be creating a farmer distress. So you require that institutional change. As you reform industry in 1991, so why not there was agriculture policy in that year? Why not before that? Why still we do not have that proper policy or institutional network framework? If you announce that policy of purchasing food at MSP, but whether you have that institutional network, policy change ho gaya, but what is the outcome? If outcome is not according to that, then again on ground it is not, the situation is not improving. But if you have better reform in the service sector, in communication sector, because technology, the fast pace of technology force you to change the policy also. Sometimes policy change is not by design, sometimes it is being forced to you. But what forces government to change the policy? Because of fast movement in technology, but technological driven है बहुत ज़्यादा.
But is it possible for agriculture and industry to be as productive as service? Because
No, you can't compare directly. It is not fair to compare service to, but it is also unfair the current situation. You require improvement in the living standard of the masses. So if the mass is involved in agriculture, you have to improve productivity there also, their income also, and for that purpose you have to invest more there. But in agriculture, world over, in agriculture the growth rate will be low. But if a few percent or percentage of workforce work in agriculture doing mechanized work, then their productivity is higher then.
Sir, so like this sentence I think I read in economic survey where he said that in the long term agriculture, the goal of the policy is to shift people, to ensure that these people are working in agriculture and move them towards service. But then how will this sector employ so many people then? If the goal is to move
This sector, service sector is not employing more sector, service sector is producing more. They are not employing more. If they start employing more, then there will be no problem. The employment elasticity of service sector is very low. If you have 1% growth in service and the same 1% growth in industry, in industry it will create more job, and in service it will create, ये skill intensive हो गया. So the productivity is higher, not number of person is higher.
So can we say that service sector is more of a luxury for the economy?
नहीं, we can't say luxury, we can't say, but luxury good also comes into that service. But we can't say service is something a luxury. If health facility is there, it is not luxury, but good health facility, that could be considered as a part. But basic health service, basic education, it is part of that basic need. So that basic need, communication is basic need. Having mobile is your basic need now, but having iPhone is not your basic need. So that you have to differentiate that. But that service is necessary. So service sector का जो growth हो, but it is natural. The progression is natural. Obviously, with respect to time, we can say it would have been better that industry would have expanded. But if industry has not expanded, to some extent we can say lack of that second generation reform. If you have to critically evaluate, then industrial reform started in 1991. Economic reform was mainly industrial reform. But due to lack of that second generation reform, there was no, or we can say neglect of that MSME sector also. The too much focus on the large industries. That neglect is also responsible for that purpose.
Sir, is there no other economy comparable which has done this leapfrogging?
No, ऐसा नहीं है. Leapfrogging है और भी कंट्रीज में एग्जैक्टली एग्जांपल जहाँ जहाँ इस तरीके का प्रॉब्लम होगा. अर्जेंटीना वगैरह के अंदर भी जो क्राइसिस एक्चुअल में वो ज़्यादा है. ब्राज़ील वो एक्चुअल में क्राइसिस एक्चुअल में वो ज़्यादा है. हाँ, इन when you compare India, the better way to compare India is always with China, because more or less in 1960s or 70s India and China were at same level. The difference started since 1978 to be precise. So till 1970s we can say they were at same level, but in 1978 China started reform. In 1991 India started reform. There is difference in timing of reform, there is difference in sequence of reform. Reform matters, sequence of reform matters more. In 1991 economy was liberalized and globalized at the same point of time. You have liberalization policy as well as globalization policy. You liberalize the economy so that the domestic industry will grow, and you globalize the economy so that domestic industry and foreign firms can compete. But if both are happening together, then you are not allowing domestic industry or not giving domestic industry enough time to face competition from the foreign firms. What happened in China, they liberalized the economy first. So the economy was liberalized first, internal problems, rigidities were overcome first. After that the economy was open up for the rest of the world. So the sequence was different. Second important difference between India and China is, in India we focus too much on, and in China the reform started with the rural reform. It was mainly agriculture reform. They were more, we can say, pragmatic in approach. उनका approach जो reform का था वो ज़्यादा pragmatic था. They adopted reform in a proper sequence. We faltered there. Rather than focusing too much initially on agriculture, we were focusing too much on industry from the beginning. And in addition to that, the neglect of human capital is also one of the important problem, because if you create more human capital, then there will be more person doing that service, then income will be distributed between large number of person. But if it is not there, then human capital, if the spread of human capital is less, then few person will be earning more income. So in terms of literacy or education also, the parameters were better for the China as compared to the Indian economy. So when if you are focusing on the service sector, obviously that service, but obviously it is always to some extent unfair to compare one economy with the other economy, as the situation in both economy are not always same, as it is simply unfair to compare one person with the other person, because they are two different persons. So accordingly you can't compare economy as well. Each economy has its uniqueness. So India has its own uniqueness, China has its own uniqueness. Next, इसको आप सब हेडिंग वहाँ चेंज कर लेंगे. आफ्टर चेंजिंग दैट, make employment. The service sector contribution, to overall employment, service sector contribution to overall employment has increased. The service sector contribution to overall employment has increased, but it is not in accordance with growth in service sector. It is not in accordance with growth in service sector. The share of employment increased from 20% 20.8% to 25.1%, 25.1% between 1991 and 2001, rather between 1991 2001 and 2001 to 2011. In that period, this to this. Its share in employment has increased marginally. Its share in employment has increased marginally. But its share in GDP increased significantly. This implies that there is low employment elasticity. This implies that there is low employment elasticity in service sector. Low employment elasticity in service sector. Therefore, we can say that growth in service sector has been mainly based on productivity gain. And technological improvement. Productivity gain and technological improvement. Full stop. Most of this employment is created in trade and distribution, construction, hotels and restaurants, community and personal service. But recently, communication and financial services are growing at a faster rate. Next subheading is trade. जब आप सर्वे वगैरह को यूज़ करेंगे तो उसमें मेंस के आंसर के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से ज़्यादा इनिशियल जो पैराग्राफ होगा से वही होगा. So chapter 12 of survey on chapter number 9. So there are various subtopics. If you are highlighting one subtopic, कोई certain अगर area आप use कर रहे हो आंसर लिखते समय, then because next survey जब available होगा तो same patterns के अंदर भी रहना है. So if you are FDI in India's service sector, India's service trade. So these type of information or paragraph can be included in your answer when you are explaining major services and their overall performance. So what are the major component of service? So within service you have to explain that. Service itself is the major component of overall GDP, but for service sector itself. But you can, after that you can ignore the minor subtopics. It is not required that each and every page. So 10 or 12 pages जो given होंगे, for your purpose it will be hardly 1 or 2 pages that will be relevant. But for when you are reading any, preparing any topic, it is always advisable that you go with by that survey also. वो recent जो government का version होगा at least वो clear रहेगा. And the language in the survey is also very good. So you can copy it directly as it is. So in the first paragraph etc. जो introductory होता है वो काफ़ी better condition होता है. It will be helping you to start an answer. So it preferably you can start with the directly in the same language. Within trade, the contribution of service, the contribution of services to India's trade and FDI flow, the contribution of services to India's trade and FDI flow has also been growing over past decade, and thereby it is helping India's integration, with world economy. Full stop. India's service export has increased substantially along with India's service import, So India has moved to trade surplus in service. Which has helped in offsetting its trade deficit in goods, and thereby controlling current account deficit. So in that current account you include goods as well as services. So we have surplus in service but deficit in goods, but overall that helps to control that current account. Next paragraph. The average annual growth rate of India's service sector has accelerated significantly accelerated significantly. These trends highlight export oriented nature of service growth, in Indian economy, as well as it highlights competitiveness of Indian economy, in world service market, especially since 2000. So if you are able to export a lot of services, it means you have more and more comparative advantage in many services. So it also indicate growing export of service indicate your comparative advantage in services. And if your manufactured exports is declining, it shows lack of competitiveness in manufactured commodities. As a result, share of service in India's total export, has risen from 18.1% in 1995 to over 30%, to over 35% since 2010. So out of that overall export, including all items, the share of service is more than 35%. In that respect, India has outperformed other economies, including China. Next paragraph. A rapid growth in service trade has led to India's increased share in world service market. It is important to note that India's service export has become more broad-based over the last decade as share of many services has increased. Share of many services has increased. For example, software services increase their contribution from 0% in 1995, मतलब सर्विस एक्सपोर्ट की बात हो रही है, from 0% in 1995 to 28% in 2000, 28% in 2000, and 51.5% and more since 2010. It reflects significant growth in software services. The diversification of service export can be observed with the emergence of segments such as financial, insurance, construction service, etc. Next paragraph. However, India's service export remains constrained by domestic and external barrier. The main domestic barriers are infrastructure, financial, regulatory, and standard related constraint. So the main external barriers are in the form of immigration. And labor market regulation. Which limit India's ability to deliver services through the temporary cross-border movement, through the temporary cross-border movement, through the temporary cross-border movement of service provider, of service provider. Remember, when you explain any, rather the point can be generalized for other services also. When you target export, then to increase export there are always internal barrier and external barrier. The internal barrier will always include infrastructure, financial problems, regulations, environment. So those are internal barriers which limit your ability to export. In addition to that, you are constrained by external barriers, immigration laws, movement on labor. So if US has a strict visa policy, then your export of services will decline because US is not allowing more visa to the Indian workers. So there are some external barriers, although we cannot deal more with that external barrier, but you can deal with internal one. So the focus is always on the internal solution, how it can be dealt internally. So in that trade, make specifically FDI, foreign direct investment. Next subheading. There are different aspects. So if question is coming directly on that aspect, you have to highlight only that much. FDI for service sector itself. There has also been a structural shift. There has also been a structural shift in FDI flow into India, FDI flow into India in service sector, in service sector. The average share of services, the average share of services in FDI increased from 10.5% in 1994 to 28.3% in 1995-99, and since 2000 services accounted for nearly 75% of FDI inflow. Nearly 75% of FDI inflow. The range of service subsector, attracting FDI has expanded over time, with a growing share of business services, So certain services like telecommunication and construction, have remained important. Telecommunication and construction have remained important throughout the period, remained important throughout the period, while some services like housing and real estate service have become attractive destination for FDI flow, attractive destination for FDI flow in recent years. The importance of segments such as telecommunication and real estate, reflect India's internal growth, and liberalization dynamics. India's internal growth and liberalization dynamics which have driven the expansion of services. Next paragraph. Perhaps the most significant feature of service sector liberalization, has been elimination of government monopoly, and establishment of independent regulator. जैसे टेलीकम्युनिकेशन वगैरह में गवर्नमेंट की मोनोपोली होती थी, गवर्नमेंट की मोनोपोली हटा करके अब उसकी जगह प्राइवेट इट वाज ओपन एंड देन इट वाज रेगुलेटेड. You have to create a regulatory body always. Unless that regulatory body you don't create, the market will not, because private players will compete always with each other. So for regulation you require a regulatory body. So in the telecommunication regulatory authority है, insurance के अंदर regulatory authority है. So in those services where regulatory authorities were established first, expansion of those services occurred at a faster rate. So from that also we can say that for achieving any growth target you require certain set of policies, institutional setup चाहिए उसके लिए. FDI has been permitted in most segment. FDI has been permitted in most segment with a ceiling of 74% foreign equity participation. 74% foreign equity participation and even 100% in some other cases. Even 100% in some other cases. Nowadays, more and more service sector has been opened up for greater foreign equity participation. Foreign equity participation. इस एग्जांपल के लिए आप कई जगह जहाँ पे एक्सप्लेन कर रहे हैं, ऑटोमोबाइल सेक्टर है या कार मैन्युफैक्चरिंग इंडस्ट्री है तो 100% फॉरेन इक्विटी पॉसिबल है. 91 when the reform occurred in 1991, when you said foreign investment allowed, so when foreign investment was allowed, it was allowed up to a limit and in certain areas. So still in that case you said 51% equity can be held by foreign firms. That means you gave the majority stake to the foreign companies. So that means you are inviting a joint venture. So if foreign investor will come, that foreign investor will choose a domestic partner. That domestic partner will have that 49% and that foreign investor can have the equity of, but not in all the sectors. But subsequently many more sectors were opened up and in certain sector it is even 100%. बहुत सारे इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट के अंदर भी है, कार मैन्युफैक्चरिंग में भी है, बट स्टिल सम सेक्टर्स विच आर स्टिल नॉट ओपन टिल 51% ऑल्सो. तो गवर्नमेंट इज कंट्रोलिंग सम सर्विसेज लाइक प्रिंट मीडिया. उस फॉर्म में प्रिंट मीडिया में कोई फॉरेन इन्वेस्टर, FDI का फ्लो रिस्ट्रिक्टेड. देन डिफेंस FDI 100%. Insurance, you have any fully owned foreign insurance company, fully owned, जहाँ कोई इंडियन वेंचर नहीं होगा? No, इंश्योरेंस में भी नहीं है. That means you are allowing up to say 74%. That means there will be a domestic partner as well. So in certain areas 100%, in many areas less than 100%, but obviously as compared to 1991 or before that, the FDI flow has been more in service sector. तो एग्जाम्पल के लिए आप कहीं भी, जैसे फॉर एग्जाम्पल द कंट्रोवर्शियल केस वाज ऑफ मल्टी ब्रांड रिटेलिंग और सिंगल ब्रांड रिटेलिंग. ठीक है. सो इन रिटेल ऑल्सो नाउ देयर इज 100% FDI allowed. Next paragraph. However, service liberalization has not been a smooth process. Service liberalization has not been a smooth process. In several subsectors, there has been considerable national debate. And one such segment was retail. Which was partially open to FDI, in single brand segment, but now 100% foreign equity is allowed, but now 100% equity is allowed. Similarly, legal services remain closed to foreign firms. Legal services remain closed to foreign firms and service provider. So another service sector where there has been much debate is higher education. Because obviously there are concerned about the quality and control. Overall, the debate concerning service liberalization has centered around issue of equity and efficiency trade-off, and its impact on domestic player. Full stop. It has also been evident that service liberalization needs to be accompanied by supporting domestic regulation. There is evidence to suggest that service liberalization has yielded efficiency gain. To the Indian economy. लास्ट में एक पैराग्राफ सर्वे के अकॉर्डिंग लिख देना, ये आप बिगनिंग में लिखो या एंड में, बट सर्वे के अकॉर्डिंग एक पैराग्राफ डायरेक्टली फ्रॉम सर्वे नोट कर लिए लास्ट. द सर्विस सेक्टर with share of 55.2% in India's gross value added, continue to be a key driver of India's growth. contributing almost 72.5% of gross value added growth. 72.5% of gross value added growth in 2017-18. In 2017-18, while मतलब जो ग्रोथ है उस ग्रोथ में उसका कंट्रीब्यूशन 72.8%. It is not overall GDP. The growth, while the growth in this sector is expected to be, while the growth in this sector is expected to be 8.3%, growth in this sector is expected to be 8.3%. After comma, the growth in service export, the growth in service export is expected to be 16.2%. 16.2%. The government has taken many initiatives. The government has taken many initiatives. Many initiatives in different services. In different services. Which include digitalization, comma Startup India, and schemes for banking sector, which could increase growth of this sector further. Which could increase growth of this sector further. ठीक है, तो ये सर्वे यहाँ से अब चैप्टर नंबर 9 का जो स्टार्टिंग पार्ट था बेसिकली वो आपने लिखा. इस तरीके का इंट्रोडक्टरी कमेंट हुआ करेगा वहाँ पे, तो बेटर है वो आप उसको डायरेक्टली एज इट इज़ फॉर इंटरनेशनल कंपेरिजन यू कैन रीड दिस चैप्टर नंबर 9 फ्रॉम सर्वे. और जनवरी फरवरी तक जब ये नेक्स्ट सर्वे आ जाएगा उसमें कोई अपडेट होगा तो उसके अकॉर्डिंगली. सो अगेन लीव 1 पेज. ठीक है, जहाँ भी आप एंड करते हैं उसमें ऐड ऑन करने के लिए लीव सम स्पेस to add on. तो sector wise analysis में we have done the first sector. तो यहाँ से ये सेक्टर वाइज में ये अपने सर्विस में कोई सब सेक्टर फर्दर नहीं आना है, बट इन इंडस्ट्री एंड एग्रीकल्चर देयर विल बी मेनी पार्ट्स. सो नेक्स्ट विल बी इंडस्ट्री एंड एग्रीकल्चर. ठीक है, कल इंडस्ट्री और एग्रीकल्चर का हो. रिमेंबर जो आप लिख रहे हो उसको थोड़ा शॉर्ट करना, अदरवाइज वो पेपर 2 में याद नहीं रहता वो पॉइंट्स. सो यू हैव व्हाट यू हैव टू डू, you have to make a synopsis out of this because you can't write all. So you have to make a synopsis so that you can recall that point. So without skipping the major points, you have to recall those points and you have to reproduce it then. But at least 1 or 2 paragraph you can learn, the main one जहाँ से आप start करें, and few data you have to learn. ठीक है, without otherwise how you substantiate your argument. Growth has increased, but how to substantiate? For that purpose you require data. So you have to learn those data as well. ठीक है, चलो.